Welcome to the Vashon Heritage Museum's History Talks, and this is the third in a special 8-part series of talks on Vashon 101. Our guest speaker this evening is Bina McLeod, a Puyallup tribe member. Bina will draw on her personal frontline experience as daughter of the renowned Indigenous activist Janet McLeod, Tulalip, and fisherman Don McLeod Sr., Puyallup. Next slide, please. I'm Elsa Kronquist, the Executive Director of the Vashon Heritage Museum, and I'd like to take a moment to recognize the sponsors of our history talks and say thank you to For Culture and Humanities Washington, and to all the speakers who will be presenting throughout the 8-part series, specifically this evening, Bina McLeod and Patrick Christie. Also, this talk and almost all of our talks are recorded and can be found about a week after the presentation on the Vashon Heritage Museum website. At this time, I'd like to introduce a board member, Chris Austin, who will read the land acknowledgement statement. Chris?
Thank you, Elsa. The Vashon Heritage Museum stands on the ancestral lands of the Shwabopts, or Swiftwater people, who inhabited Vashon Maury Island for millennia. The Donation Land Claim Act encouraged large numbers of Euro-American settlers to claim this land, even before the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854 extinguished native claims to it. The Shwabopts were forcibly removed and relocated onto nearby reservations, including Puyallup, Nisqually, Squaxin Island, and Muckleshoot. We acknowledge the people of the Puyallup tribes whose stewardship of and relationship with Vashon Maury Island continues today. We commit to amplify the voices of Indigenous people, making space for them to tell their own story, both past and present, in our exhibits and programs. Back to you, Elsa.
Our inclusion pledge. The Vashon Maury Island Heritage Museum rejects racism, discrimination, and hate. Our purpose is to honor stories of love, oppression, action, and resilience. Stories that give voice to all, examine hard questions about social, economic, and environmental justice, and reveal racism and oppression within our heritage. We pledge that everything we do will honor the island's diversity of cultures and histories. So at this time, it's my honor to introduce Patrick Christie, who will comment on our Vashon 101 series and introduce tonight's speaker. Patrick has lived on Vashon since 2001. He was trained as both an aquatic biologist and sociologist at the University of Wisconsin and University of Michigan. He started his career as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer working in a Filipino community to protect and restore a coral reef. He is now a professor of the University of Washington, where he studies and teaches about how people relate to the ocean and how we can best organize society to improve sustainability. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you so much, Elsa, for that. Some of you have already heard this introduction before. For me, Vashon 101 is above all a community building event. And as you see from the speaker series in front of you now, we cover a wide variety of topics in Vashon 101. Most notably, we're honored with the presence of 2 Indigenous teachers who are going to offer us deep understanding of this place we call Vashon and Maury Islands and the surrounding areas. In fact, this evening we have one such guest speaking and teaching us tonight. Let's keep in mind that the land acknowledgement in their best form goes beyond acknowledging the original inhabitants of a place, as important as that is, to expressing our commitment to positive change, as we call that island and the surrounding areas. We need to support Indigenous rights as allies. We have much to learn from one another, so we invite you to be an active participant in Vashon 101, to learn from and alongside our speakers. Practically, I invite you to look for overarching themes, as well as unexplored topics, as you listen to each of the speakers. These themes will form the backbone of the final session of Vashon 101, So let's commit to taking what we learn to improve Vashon and our relations with those we know and those we may not have the privilege of, may not have had the privilege of taking this class or living here. For me, themes like sustainability, equity, and how history shapes our society will come to the forefront. But I invite you to identify your own themes that resonate with you. In short, I believe I speak on behalf of all the speakers when I say we look forward to learning together and using this opportunity to grow and to improve the place we call home. And as I've done every week, I'd like to do a very brief reminder of what was covered last month, when Dr. Tom DeVries talked to us about the history of Vashon's ecology. Dr. DeVries talked extensively of using the framing of paleoecology, looking at the historic record and how ecology on this island has changed over time. He was really identifying the themes that climate has changed in this region repeatedly, particularly as a result of the glaciation in this area. He also reminds us that there were remarkable organisms, for example, 14,000 years before present, there were massive bison and mastodons on this island. About 12,000 years before present, the ecosystem began to change, become more moist, and becomes more recognizable to us today with common tree species that we have, like cedar and the like. Also, the glaciers, as they retreated and advanced, created special habitats where certain species of plants thrived. And we have a lot of diversity in the ecosystems of Vashon as a result of the topography. Of course, when we all probably recognize that when colonizers arrived in this area, Euro-American colonizers, they massively deforested this island. And I think it was remarked, for example, for the creation of bricks and the like. There was also tremendous overfishing that took place in the Puget Sound, which is the southern half of the Salish Sea. And that brings us to our theme for this evening. And so now I'd like to set the stage for our speaker tonight. Next slide, please. I've known Bina McLeod now for a couple of years, and it's really been an honor to get to know Bina. I know Bina as the director of student success and culture at Chief Leschi Schools. Chief Leschi Schools is near Puyallup, or in Puyallup. It is a tribal school that has attendance by students from over 60 tribes. There are 680 students. It is a beautiful campus. I've had the honor of bringing University of Washington students to Chief Leschi Schools for the last year and to create digital stories and videos with Chief Leschi students about culture and canoe journey and the like. The curriculum of Chief Leschi Schools centers Indigenous cultures. And it's really been a remarkable journey for me to learn how Chief Leschi School thrives. So before we get into, and so next slide, please, or just the camera, please. As background, I've talked to a number of people on the island about their knowledge about the fish wars and the Bolt decision. And it's important to have a little bit of background before Bina gets into her stories and her recollection of that and its contemporary impacts. I'll be posting shortly in the chat some links to some information for you. To start out with, today is Billy Frank Day. So it's appropriate that we have Bina speaking. Perhaps someday there'll be a Janet McLeod Day, appropriately. In 1855, 2 years after Washington was split from the Oregon Territory, the government of Washington signed various treaties with local tribes to compel Native peoples to move to reservations. Commercial fishing by settlers, as pointed out by Tom DeVries in the last talk, went unmanaged, and fish takes were unsustainable. Tribal fishermen were prevented from fishing where and when they had so traditionally. In 1937, in fact, the federal court granted a petition to prevent the state of Washington from interfering with Native fishing rights, but there in fact was no enforcement of that decision in 1937. local authorities continue to police the water and issue citations and arrests of native fishers. And they notably frequently use the term conservation to justify their actions. And that may be a shock to many environmentalists or conservationists, but some people would suggest that they weaponize the term conservation to disenfranchise Native American fishers and other peoples. In 1945, Willie Frank's 14-year-old son, Billy Frank Jr., was arrested for fishing with a net. That would be proved to be the first of many confrontations between the younger Billy Frank and the state authorities. It's important to note that treaty rights are civil rights. They encode inherent rights that are linked to the presence of people that have been here for many thousands of years, since time immemorial. So these rights are just like our right to vote. They're protected under the US Constitution and are the supreme law of the land. In fact, treaties trump state law. They're only second to the US Constitution as explained by the Constitution. To defend the treaty and inherent rights, tribes mounted nonviolent resistance efforts patterned after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. strategies and his civil rights campaign. The fish wars were a series of civil disobedience protests in the 1960s and 70s. They started, in fact, in the 50s, but most notably in the 60s and 70s, in which Native American tribes around Puget Sound pressured Washington state government to recognize these fishing rights, these inherent rights that were encoded in the treaties that they signed. There were a series of fishing demonstrations in the Pacific Northwest, and they grew. They became highly covered quite a bit in the media. There were celebrities participating like Marlon Brando and Jane Fonda and the like. A U.S. attorney from Western Washington, Judge Pitkin, was U.S. Attorney Pitkin was part of the crowd that came to watch the arrest of 60 men, women, and teenagers. And troubled by what he saw, he took the first steps to file U.S. versus Washington on behalf of the tribes. So one thing you need to recognize is just like the U.S. federal government took southern states to court to recognize African American rights, they did the same to the state of Washington. And when I'm at the University of Washington teaching about indigenous rights, I use frequently the phrase that, as Alabama was to Black people, Washington state was to Native American peoples. And that may come to a shock to a lot of Washingtonians. In 1974, there was a decision in the United States versus Washington that's frequently referred to as the Bolt decision. And it made clear that that the tribes had ceded land to Washington state. In its creation, they retained their inherent right that was acknowledged in the treaty to fish in common. And he determined that the term to fish in common in 19th century parlance mean that the tribes had right to 50% of salmon harvests in their usual and accustomed fishing grounds. And this, in fact, Judge Bolt ruling in 74 was upheld by the US Supreme Court in 1979. One thing that's important to note is that this struggle and the subsequent victory has inspired indigenous peoples and many peoples around the world, in Canada, Wisconsin, and elsewhere for their rights. And the Bolt decision established the tribes as natural resource co-managers, meaning that the state of Washington and tribes have to agree to fish harvests. One thing that's also very important to recognize is that treaty rights protect everybody's rights. And so frequently people will say, well, these are just rights for the tribes, but that's in fact a mischaracterization. We all want a sustainable Salish Sea or Puget Sound. And in fact, I think it's clear that the treaties protect all of our rights. In conclusion, before I hand it over to Bina, we'll be having a dialogue here, is, as Billy Frank and many people have said, 50% of zero is zero. And so there's, and many people are quite concerned where salmon stocks are headed, particularly because of the loss of important habitats and the growth in this area. So it's quite important, Bina, what you have to tell us this evening. And as we agreed before, I would start out with a question, just a very simple question, and we'll mostly have a dialogue here, which is, When you think back to your experience during the time of the fish wars, could you just share with us an early memory that you have of those times?
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me here to Vashon. It's a really beautiful island. Last time I was here was about 25 years ago, digging clams over here on the coast from one of our cultural days at Chief Leschi. But I'd like to properly introduce myself. My name is Bina McLeod. I am the daughter, the youngest of 8, the daughter of Don and Janet McLeod, Yetzi Blue, the granddaughter of Mae McCoy, and mother's side, and the granddaughter of Willie and Angie Frank on my father's side. So we always try to acknowledge those generations that came before us, that kind of brought us to this point in life. Thank you for the professor's bird's eye view of the fishing wars. I enjoyed that. I had to really follow. But anyways, when you asked me about an earliest memory of the fishing wars, I have to go back to October 13th, 1965. And so Frank's Landing, where all of these wars took place, and Billy Frank is my uncle, my brother, my father's youngest brother. And that's where our grandparents lived, and we would go, and that's where we would go every weekend to go swim, play in the sand, and just hang out at our grandparents' house. I was 4 years old at the time, and we went down there on October 13th, 1965, and they invited newspaper people to go and to be there. And so when we got down there, I looked at it like I was just going to my grandparents' house. And they loaded up my dad and another fisherman and my 2 brothers and a cameraman. And they pushed them out into the river, and they were going to lay a net. And so when they got out there, then these game wardens came from, out of the bushes in boats from under the trees in the river, and they were all over, and mayhem broke out. They began to beat everybody up on that beach, and a majority of us were women and children, and so that was my first vision. I can remember picking up mud and throwing it, and watching my parents get beat up, and my cousins and everybody, and I can really remember that day distinctly. What I can't remember is what happened after, because they arrested my parents. And so I often ask my sisters, what happened to us? Where did we go if they arrested mom and dad? And she says, well, we stayed at Grandma Grass for a while, and then they released my mom and dad, and I guess we went home. And so anyways, I always believed that on that day that I lost my innocence and I was born a child of the movement, because that would be what my life consisted of to this day, and my father really tried to shelter us from that type of stuff. And so when there was an encampment, when Dick Gregory went to jail for fishing wars in the 60s and decided to fast in the jail, we set up an encampment across from the jail. And when they decided to tear it down, we weren't there, so the younger siblings weren't there at those more violent type of events that were taking place in the 60s. That was the only time that I would ever witness that. The other time is when they set up the encampment in the 70s. So I'd be probably about 10 or 11. And on the Puyallup River, which they have just now in the last 4 years named it the Fish Wars Bridge. And so there was an encampment there. And when they tore that one down, we didn't witness that either, or I didn't. And so I think the stories that leading up to this, stories from my mother and from my father is, my mother was from Seattle up towards Tulalip area, and from Seattle, and fell in love and married my father and moved to Nisqually. And she can remember sitting in her home, and the game wardens would come to our house with a generic search warrant. And she says, well, what are you doing? Do you got a search warrant? They go, yeah, we have this one that allows us into any one of your homes. And that gave them the right to look through her freezer, through the refrigerator. And if there was any wild game or salmon, well, then they got cited or arrested. And so when you look back, when you go back even further to the Treaty of 1854, the Medicine Creek Treaty, which was the Squaxin Island, the Squally and Puyallup. And as long as the river runs, the grass grows, and the sun shines, you can fish and hunt in your usual and custom area. And so, like most things, you know, like they placed our people on reservations, and they did things like this without realizing that one day they would want whatever was sitting on that land or whatever was granted at that time. And so there was no way to preserve the salmon, right? There was really, you know, you caught it, and then, you know, it was kind of, you know, there. And then I can remember my father telling stories that when the cannery was invented, there was 10 or 15 of them along in the Squally River, you know, and the fish used to run so thick you could walk across their backs, you know, go across the river on their backs. And then the cannery was invented. Well, of course, then again, once again, you know, you look at the indigenous people standing in the way of progress. And so we can't really forget how they kind of forgot that they had a treaty, right? Unless we really acknowledge the residential school era, you know, where they had removed, you know, not that far back, so it would be my grandparents' age, removed them and put them in residential schools across the country. And the philosophy on that was, you know, kill the Indian, save the man. And so instilling a lot of shame. You couldn't speak your language, you couldn't sing your songs, you couldn't dress in your traditional clothing or any of that. At least you get beaten or whatever, but you were so far away from home that you couldn't find your way back. So when they did finally make their way back, they were broken people, right? They weren't teaching the language to the next generation or teaching really anything to the next generation. And those that did teach, you know, a lot of it was in hiding, like, you know, the songs and the dance. A lot of those survived because those old Indians taught younger kids those songs in hiding. So we didn't have religious freedom until what, 1978, where we could partake in our ceremonies legally, you know, things like the Sundance or, you know, the smokehouse in this area. And so, you know, so when you look at that era and then you get into the real shame and the broken, and you get into the alcoholism that you know, embraced and devoured our people. And then you have a few people going, well, wait a minute, what do you mean you got a generic search warrant? Or, you know, what's going on? And then pretty soon they kind of started kind of waking up. Hey, what, you know, what's kind of going on here? You know, don't we have a right here to do this? And then, you know, looking at the treaties, what the treaties said, and what all that was about, you know, because treaties can only be made between nations. And I think I read somewhere there was like 300 and some written with all Native Americans across country. And so now we're in the progress of sports fishing, and we're in the progress of big profit because the cannery was invented. And so when the fishing wars kind of started, it kind of started in the 50s, really, small little battles that took place. And then, you know, that whole day on October 13th, 1965 was to bring attention to the fishing wars. And that's what it did. And so when it blew open on a national level about what was happening to the Native people, you know, on the riverbanks and in the Squally River, well, then that's when the celebrities like Marlon Brando, Jane Fonda, Dick Gregory come and spent 60 days in jail or something, like fasted through the whole time. And, you know, bringing it to a real national level. And so when we look at the domino effect of what happened there, you know, a lot of people who were part of the American Indian movement, like John Trudell and Dennis Banks, says things always started in the Northwest, and then they come across country. And so shortly after the fishing war started, then the American Indian movement established in Minneapolis, and they were actually called the American Indian, wasn't the movement, it was like security, because their people were getting beaten on the streets in Minneapolis. So they started security to support their communities, which turned into a bigger thing, which led to Wounded Knee and then Alcatraz. And so it was a real domino effect that happened here as Native American people began to stand and rise and take pride in who they were again. But by that time now, we had lost a big portion of our language. We had lost a big portion of our ceremonies and our self-identity. So a real resurgence and resurrection happened in the 60s and 70s, and it was a real time of change for the people, a time where, pride was established again, because I think the biggest thing that the residential schools did was, to create that shame and being a Native American, or being from this. And when you look back in history, and not only the fishing wars and all of the things that evolved out of that, it's the movie called Rumble, where it talks about the Native American impact on the modern music scene. But because of that shame that was instilled in the people, a lot of them would deny that they were Native American. And so, very talented in that aspect too. So when the fishing wars happened, it was really a domino effect of change across the country, and people saying, no more, and the old medicine people coming back and taking those young leaders into ceremony, into sweat lodge, and to ceremonies where they'd sacrifice and learn to pray, and to have strength to carry on that, because that was the turning point of Native Americans changing around what the perception of us would be and would become later today. And so when you look at that time, I can remember my mother, began to be an activist in the 1960s. And I can remember, just on she had 6 filing cabinets, when she passed. And I can remember seeing a letter in there that was a letter to President Kennedy in the early 60s saying, we demand our medical and dental care on this reservation. It's in the treaties, it was promised us, and we would like to have it. And so there was a lot of things in those treaties that were just kind of overlooked, and every one that was ever made with the Native American tribe has been broken, and so if they are the law of the land, that's what it represented to us. And so the fishing war was a real turning point. And because at 4 years old and watching my parents and my siblings go through that all my life, to this day, I will still get fish, I will still smoke it, and I will still put it in jars, and I will share it, and I will give it away, because to honor those that fought for my right to be able to do that. Because had that whole battle turned out differently in the 60s and 70s, I would not be able to do that. I would not be able to go and smoke fish, put it in one of our smokers and smoke it the way that my grandmother taught my father and my father taught us, and the siblings, and still doing that to this day. So it's really, it was a turning point of rebirth for Native Americans. If you look today, you have land acknowledgements, you have signs in our language that was real close to extinction. Our language is real close to extinction until it finally came back, in the 80s and 90s, when people really made an attempt to learn that, and so things won't be the way that they were prior to all of that, but they are. There's a real sense of, of pride, and financial stability. And, sometimes people just identify us as casino people, but they don't realize that Native Americans lived on or below the poverty level clean up until the 80s. Then casinos come and give kind of a little lift up to be able to develop some financial independencies, from grants, or however these tribes used to survive prior to that. And so that time of I call it the time of the real warriors that stood up, and I can remember my mother wrote like a footnote in the Spirit of Crazy Horse. And she talks about, the warriors of that time, and who's reaping the harvest of those warriors, that are lying in prisons. We have one that's still in prison. Leonard Peltier are now lying in graves, and they're the ones who put their life on the line to make that difference for me and for 7 generations behind me. And so, you know, it was the fishing wars, but it was, and I don't think people really understand the real impact and representation that it had in Indian country.
So thank you so much, Bina. And as I hear what you say, and those are really profound words, and you know, I think about, you know, you're an educator now, you're working at a school, and you know, one of the things that I think is I think on many people's minds is, so you talk of the trauma, you talk about the shame of the residential school system, you talk of the shame associated with seeing your parents incarcerated and beaten for doing things that are very well within their right to do and they're part of their culture. What do you see in the school now that you teach at? Do you see, I mean, I want us to, if you'd be willing to be honest with us about the situation that you observe at Chief Leshai schools, and do you see, what do you, when you look forward, are you hopeful or are you concerned? You remain, what's your take now with the youth in particular?
Well, I think that it's still a work in progress, but you know, I heard what's his name? Cladsbury?
Brian Clattersby?
Yeah, from Swinomish.
Swinomish, yeah.
And I heard him talk one time. We were on a panel together, and he said it takes 2 generations to break the cycle of addiction, or to break the cycle of all of that, you know. And I see it because when I first came to Leshai, we didn't have no Puyallup songs. We sang predominantly Alaskan and powwow. There was no language program, and there was maybe 150 kids, you know. And I left in 2000. When I came back in 2015, I was just overwhelmed with the beauty of, you know, people singing Puyallup songs. The language is really strong and coming back into the school. And I think that that our whole goal is to try and teach them to walk in 2 worlds, to be able to go out there into the general society and be whoever you want to be, but don't forget that your roots are 1,000 years deep here. Don't forget where you come from. Don't forget who you are. Don't forget, you know, your identity. And to teach them to have that balance, because sometimes they go way over here and they forget to come back, or sometimes, you know, they don't ever venture out. They just stay there. And so, but also trying to teach them that we are nature. We are not part of nature. We are nature. And so when they're looking at science, or they're looking at math, or they're looking at these different classes, it's who we are. We've always been builders, musicians, mathematicians, engineers. I mean, we didn't have to go to school to do that. You know, for us, it was identified in the little toddler, you know, who had a drum, or the little toddler who picked up a stick and started building something. They were identified at a very young age as to where they were going to be trained to grow up to be, you know. And so having our students to help identify that we are, don't look at science as this, look at it as learning about who you are in the sense of the world, the creation around you, you know, because we believe that we were placed on this earth to be the caretakers of Mother Earth, that we are her caretakers. And so always having that respect, giving thanks, you know, we don't ever take nothing without giving thanks, you know, from the mountains or from the water. And, you know, we still do our ceremonies acknowledging those things, because it's all gifts and we're all part of that, right? We're all part of that creation. And so, so teaching them, I think, is trying to teach them the simplicity of who we are as people. And sometimes it's so simple that we forget to see it. We fail to see it, you know. That I heard that from a clan mother from 6 Nations one time. Our way of life is so simple, but sometimes we fail to see it. And so how do you keep them in the simplicity with a world that's moving so fast, you know? And the times we're in now was prophesized by the Hopis. They call it Koyani Skatse. And that means that the world's moving so fast, you know. And then we wonder why our kids want to go into another dimension, into gaming. Mm-hmm. Look how fast this place is moving out here, you know. They can't keep up. And so And so where we're at was kind of really prophesized, by those old ones back when, when I was young, and where the world's going to be, and to always remember who you are, and plant your gardens, and tend to your food, and make sure you do those simple things in life, because that's ultimately what's going to sustain us.
You used the term earlier, and I think you were introduced as this, but you wanted us to introduce you as a child of the movement. So I want to ask you to, talk a little bit about that, if you wouldn't mind. So when you think of that phrase, child of the movement, does that bring up images or thoughts in your mind about the difficulties, or is it partly about the fun? And then also, how does it shape being a McLeod today?
Well, my childhood was not normal. It was not normal. I think I was telling somebody, I mean, we were involved in everything. We went to the rock festivals of the 60s up here in Salton, and I can remember people running around naked, and my dad would say, "Don't look, you go blind." And they'd be selling fish and fry bread and corn, and so the rock festivals, and traveling to the elder and youth, because that's also a time when that happened, is the Spiritual Unity Caravan, they called it. And so the Hopis was sent out to travel to go see who was still living according to the Creator's laws. And so they came to each 4 directions, and we had a conference, and then we'd all travel around to different areas, and looking to see who's still living that way. And that was in the late 60s and early 70s. The American Indian movement, and I think it was Wounded Knee, 1973, when it was over. I think they all came to my mom's house, or they went to Philip Deere's house. And so we were always very actively involved, and my mom always kept us very, very involved, and pushing me out there. Here, you go lead this song. Here, you recite this poem. And she was always pushing me. I think that one of my first memories of traveling internationally alone was my father was dying of cancer, and so was Philip Deere. And Philip Deere and my mom were supposed to be, and Thomas Binyaki were supposed to be at this conference. And my mom says, "The work's got to go on." And I says, "Well, wait a minute, Dad's dying." And she was, "Yeah, and he's going to die whether you're here or whether you're not." And I said, She goes, "The work's got to continue." And so I said, "Okay." And so they gave me a ticket, and I had $60 to my name and a ticket. And I went to Amsterdam, and Thomas could not go because they wouldn't honor his Hopi passport, and Philip, of course, was dying, and then my dad was dying. So I was in Amsterdam at 21, 22 by myself. And so that kind of work, and just push that the work has to continue. You have to carry on. You have to make sure that this goes on, that it's handed down to the next generation. And so when I say that it wasn't normal, I mean, we always had people in our home. We were always hosting. We were always feeding. We were always, always taking care of somebody. And our Dennis and John and Floyd or Russell, me, they'd all make their way to my mom's house. And so always planning gatherings, always doing concerts. She was doing those before, so. It was, and I say that the child of the movement because it never ended. She just kept pushing and moving and went as far as she could. And I say that because for a while I lived with her, and she had visitors from Europe, and we were all sitting in the kitchen table talking, and I was pouring coffee, and we were talking, and she gets up and she disappears, and I'm kind of looking, still visiting with her friends from Europe. And pretty soon I go into her bedroom, and she's laying down. I go, "What are you doing? They're here to see you." And she goes, "That's what I have you for. Get back out there." So so I had to go visit with them. But it was kind of like that. It was always, we were always doing something. There was never no, I mean we did normal kid stuff, and then we did a lot more than most normal kids did, and exposed to a lot more. And our world was quite broad, being, even though we weren't there during the violent times of the encampment down at the Capitol when Dick Gregory was in jail, we were running all through there, through the sprinklers and up and down the elevators. And, you know, I mean, we were there, but we couldn't go back. And we were at the encampment of Puyallup. But when my dad kind of knew that they were going to come in and bust it up, he kind of kept us sheltered from that.
Mhm.
Amelia would tell you, he kept us sheltered from a lot of things.
Yeah, right. One thing I'd like to do is well, so we're going to have some questions. I can see people are posting things in the chat, and I think we would encourage you to post questions that come to your mind, because we're going to bring some of those to Bina's attention. But I have a couple more questions for you, at least, which are, when it comes to, I mean, the Puyallup tribe is an urban tribe, you know, and much of its land was urbanized. I mean, you go down to the waterfront, Tacoma, right? And maybe I'm overstating it, but I guess one of the things I'm trying to ask you, and I know you don't, and if you don't feel comfortable speaking on behalf of the Puyallup people, I guess you could speak as a member of the tribe. You know, could you share with us a little bit, what would you like to see 40, 50, 100 years from now for the Puyallup tribe?
That we still exist. But if tribes continue to go with blood quantum, we won't. Because tribes are voting on that on their own, right? It's not a, you know, and I think that once we go that way, I think that it'll be we won't be able to sustain, right? Because now they're saying you have to be so much blood to be enrolled, when it should be an inherent right. If you have Puyallup blood, and that's how Puyallup is now. Puyallup is, so my father was a Puyallup tribal member, which means I won't have no problem getting enrolled. My children have no problem getting enrolled. But some tribes are going by the blood quantum, and if you ain't a quarter blood of any Indian, then you can't be enrolled. And so you see a lot more tribes taking, you know, kind of taking that stance, and it's kind of difficult because it's us doing it. It's us making those regulations. And you know, some of those tribes that are bigger, you know, and have a real strong blood quantum left in their communities can sustain. But those like ours that are, you know, that we marry out and we marry out and we marry out, then pretty soon the blood quantum won't be there. But I think that the larger tribes, you know, who have that blood quantum can sustain. And so in 40 or 50 years, if we don't go that route, I think we'll be okay. I think that, you know, may not be a big tribe, but will still be a tribe here. And when I talk about, you know, close to extinction back in the 60s, so I'm a kid and I'm going with my dad to Tacoma to a house. And in this house, they're calling a meeting to order because there was no Puyallup land base. There was no land base except that cemetery and that church. And so they wanted to maintain a government. So he would go and they would call the meeting to order in this kitchen to maintain that they, you know, if it was ever asked, yes, here's our minutes, yes, and we do meet, you know. So that's how close it was at one point, you know, and we can never let that happen again, you know. So we have to educate our children, you know. We can't, you know, we can't force them to marry into another community or intermarry, but my mom used to say that's what powwows are for. Celebrations was to bring the young people in so they meet each other and marry, you know. And so I think that is just one thing that I'm kind of mixed feelings of with the blood quantum, because it eliminates, you know, in some places almost a whole generation who have that blood quantum, but not enough, you know. So that's kind of difficult in our communities.
And could you share with us a little bit about, when it comes to the environment and the Salish Sea, share with us a little bit about what students learn at Chief Leschi schools?
Well, I think that we got a really good science teacher there, Elsie, who redid Lake Leschi and took the kids down there. They planted some salmon in there, and she takes them over to fisheries. And And I think that she's really good in exposing, you know, our students in her classes, you know, the scientific part of it. But still within our community, we still have the first fish ceremony. You know, we acknowledge all those type of things too, you know, and so, you know, I think the last time I was on a panel in regards to the fishing wars, I think there's only two of us that are left. So my Uncle Billy was on that panel, and he talked about how bad it is out at the sea that a whale becomes a toxic waste site. That's how bad it is out in the ocean, you know. And my philosophy on this whole thing is, yeah, I'm Native American. Yes, I believe I'm part of nature. I am nature, and I'm in tune with nature. But the reality of the situation is if my children don't have no air to breathe, neither does yours. If they don't have fresh water to drink, neither does yours. And we have to get past all of this and start looking at it on a human being level. As human beings, how are we going to sustain a future for those generations that come after us? You know, there's that old Indian saying that says, we do not own the earth, we borrow it from our children. And I think if we can get people to think like that, you know, that'll be a lot more easier to think about, you know, what legacy you're leaving for your children, or what kind of earth are you leaving for? My son, you know, he's 25 years old, and we were talking about something, and he watches internet news. He's, well, according to the scientists, the late 30s, you know, 2030s is when this world's just going to go in pot. I said, yeah, well, they said that about 2002, when the millennium came or whatever, you know. And so when you talk to the young people, ask them what their vision of the future is and what they're seeing, and they'll tell you it looks bleak to them. So what are we doing to change that life for them?
Mm. And then before we get into the questions from the audience, and you can again, you know, you've come from, it took you quite a while. You had to leave Yelm at noon. And thank you again for the trip out here.
Well,
and
thanks for the food. It was good.
We had a nice dinner here with some Vashon venison and mussels and salmon, and we had a good gathering here just before a number of people. So, you know, we're here on Vashon, on the ancestral lands of the Shwap people, Puyallup people. Puyallup tribe owns land here on Vashon Island. The Vashon Heritage Museum is trying to get right relationship with the Puyallup tribe. And I guess, you know, you were knocking around a little bit on the island today. You were hanging out with a bunch of people from the island, some of who are activists, some who are educators and the like. And I hate to put you on the spot, but like, if you had an ask for Vashon Island, a request, and it doesn't have to be a material thing, it could be a way of being, it could be an attitude. I don't know, whatever comes to your mind, what would be your request of Vashon Island for the people that are on the class now?
I think that the sustainability you got going out here is great. You know, I mean, like the mussels we had for dinner. And I think just maintaining that and teaching whoever you can teach to grow those oyster beds or whatever it is that you're out there, plant the gardens, learn what your edible foods are, you know, because if everything comes to something, you know, I'll be in that canoe coming across over here. I'm kidding. But I think that somebody's got to be that kind of caretaker, right?
Right.
And I noticed that even like when you go up towards Orcas Islands, they're really into that, you know. And I would say just strengthen that and build that and teach people, you know. And, you know, like talking with some of your teachers and wanting to start doing a working relationship between the schools here, you know, and you know, teaching our kids to come together as little human beings, and because, you know, that's who's going to take over the earth.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, well, we both got a compliment there and a challenge. We have to keep keep working on his Vashon as well, and also keep making sure that Vina comes out here and gets well fed.
Yeah.
So I think we'll work on that. I think that's possible. So I guess I see a couple questions in the chat. I see a question from John Brown. John, good to see you. Our native plant. John is a well-known character on the island. He works on a lot of native plants and teaching us about them. So one of the questions just has to do with the dams and the Squally River. And I don't know, Bina, how knowledgeable you are about the specifics of various dams and the controversies of them, or are you down or is that something that maybe we can do some research on and bring back to the class later on?
Hanford and Cloud would be able to help you with that one.
Okay, Hanford McLeod.
Yeah.
Okay, we got it. So John, we're going to have to talk to Hanford McLeod. Okay. Okay, so here's a question here from Pam Hallman. Could you expand on the concept of Washington State and the fish wars playing the same role in native rights movement as Alabama and the Montgomery bus boycott for the African American civil rights movement? So I guess one of the questions, I guess what it's talking about is like, in your mind, as a child of the movement, in the American Indian movement, or the movement for indigenous sovereignty and indigenous rights, and was there interaction with the civil rights movement in the South?
I think they came here.
Yeah.
Shoot, they talk about. I can't think of it. Stokey, Carmichael. I can't remember what his name was, but some of them big leaders came up here during the fishing wars, and then also to Muskogee Creek down there to Philip Deers. So they did come, and like pledge like unity, you know, for the things that were happening here in our native communities. Yeah, so I can remember them.
Yeah.
Coming around.
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, I'm gonna drop a link in. Bean and I've talked about a film called As Long as the River Runs, which was created back in 1972. You can just Google YouTube As Long as the River Runs. And one of the things you'll see there is that there are a number of Black activists as well as white activists in working in solidarity with Puyallup and Nisqually protesters and fishing and the fish-ins, et cetera. So it's worth a watch. If nothing else, you get to watch a lot of interesting people with nice sideburns and bell bottoms and some great music by from that era. One question that we have here is John Brown again. Thanks for a plant question here. Do the treaties deal with any of the rights to gather medicinal plants and private properties? I guess one of the things I'm asking you is, when you think about treaty rights and the right to gather of plants, there's a lot of talk about salmon and the rights to fish.
Well, we could our tribes give us cards that says that we can harvest our medicines, our plants in the forest. So we get a little card to carry with us that we can harvest that.
I do know, Bina, that Connie McLeod, who's an elder, Puyallup elder, she's very focused on camas and camas gathering, and she's been trying to establish the rights for Puyallup to maintain camas fields in public parks in the Tacoma area and South. Camas being this important starch plant that was really important. So, and of course, yeah.
Fort Lewis lets us go gather that too.
Oh yeah.
So you can call Fort Lewis and they'll open the gates and let you come in and harvest that.
Nice. I guess I don't see any more questions. If there's other questions in the chat, please drop them there. I guess, if I don't see any more, I'd like to just ask, in closing, thank you again so much for joining us this evening, educating us about your experiences personally and the bigger picture about this important history. Do you have any more? We'd love to have you back. And I think I speak on behalf of a lot of educators. I'm sure there's people here that would love to have people from the Puyallup tribe come to the high school and the other schools and educate youth around here as well. do you have any closing remarks you'd like to make, Bina, for us, or anything that's on your mind that came up in this evening's conversations, or maybe conversations you had over dinner with people here on the island?
No, I thought the dinner was great, but I would just say, I traveled one time to Europe with Floyd Westerman, and he kept telling them young college kids, if you don't know who Floyd Westerman is, he was a well-known native folk singer, grew up in the 60s in American Indian, he was part of the American Indian movement. And so we had the pleasure of traveling through Germany together, and he kept telling those college students, go home and tell your parents they need to change their way of life. Go tell your parents they need to change their way of life. And they started getting angry at him. They started getting mad, and how can we tell our parents? And finally, I looked at Floyd. I says, do you know my mom? He goes, well, yes, I know your mom. And I says, so what if I went home and told her she needs to change her way of life? And he goes, oh, no. And I think that, in that discussion, we come to the conclusion that we have to educate our children. We have to educate our children and open their minds to the history that happened here, because they're not getting the history in the public schools that is going to tell you anything about the Native people in this community. They're not going to tell you the actual history of what happened during the 60s and 70s here. They're not going to tell you the actual history of what the treaty represented. And I think an epiphany that I had is I did go to Germany one time, and I went to this high school in Berlin, and there was posters of Dennis Banks, Floyd Westerman, my mom, Russell Means, John Trudell, all in this high school, and I thought, wow, they learned everything about them. But I'm walking down the street in Amsterdam with 2 PhDs from Austria, and I said, look, there's the Anne Frank house. And they go, who's Anne Frank? And I said, oh my God, every kid in America's got to read that book in the 5th grade. And it dawned on me, we don't want to look at our own backyard and atrocities that took place in our backyard. But Germany will say, look what they did to those poor Native Americans over there. And then America say, yeah, well, look what they did at the Holocaust, So it's really easy to look in the backyard and learn the history of Germany, but not the history of Vashon Island or the people, your neighbors that live right next to you, I mean, they started the since time immemorial curriculum in the schools, but I bet if I went and picked up a history book, it would read just about the same thing it did when I was in school, So we have to teach the children, teach them, tell them stories, take them around, show them where they're at. And that is in regards to all children,
Okay. In fact, that's a really wonderful way. And I'm going to drop one more link in the chat here. Bina is just mentioning a very important resource. It's called the Since Time Immemorial Curriculum in the state of Washington, as well as the state of Montana. I think state of Washington and Montana are the only 2 states in the union that require Native American history to be taught as written by Native American peoples. It's largely an unfunded mandate for K through 12 education, but it's really growing, and there's more and more curriculum materials. And so that's really important. We do have to educate young people, and it's really important that those histories be written by the people that know it best, the people who live that history. Yeah. So anyway, let's conclude. We're at time here. I just want to really thank so much for joining us. It's really an honor, and all kinds of thank yous from the chat as well. Okay.
I have just enough knowledge to make me dangerous.
Just enough knowledge to make. I think she's very dangerous in such a good way. All right.
Thank you.
Elsa, are you going to close it?
Well, I was going to say, Patrick, can you hear me?
Yes.
There are some questions in the question and answer. Do you see those?
Oh, okay. They would do, because we always using the chat. Okay.
Right.
Okay. Okay. How do you envision children or kids from Leschi experience or being able to spend some time in this place on Vashon to learn maybe some of what you described as sustainable practices? So again, kind of a blue sky question, like if in a perfect world, what would it look like? Would Puyallup youth from CLS come out to Vashon, what would they do?
I think that any kind of travel experience for a young person is the best experience and the best learning lesson they could ever have. If they were to come out here and do a camp, I think it would be something that they would remember the rest of their life. If your kids came over and did a camp with us, it would be something that they would remember, the rest of their lives. Because I think that travel and hands-on experience is the best education you can give them.
Okay. And I guess another question, this is from the Backbone campaign, so either Bill or Amy, I'm assuming. It says this is really a question for us, but your input is welcome. What would our community do here on Vashon to make this place a more welcoming place for Puyallup people?
Geez, lower the fee on the ferries. No, I think, we're starting off good right now. You guys doing these little 101 things, I think is a really good start. And I think that can only grow, because as you open the door, then you say, well, maybe next time we bring, a group of students to share the same way here with your students, on an evening event, and just keep moving forward, keep communicating and opening them doors.
Okay, right.
The ferry would help.
Okay, I'm drop, I'm seeing people are saying that they're not seeing some of the resources that I had put in the chat. So I'm going to put them here. I'm going to respond to Kathy Dismay's here. Hopefully these will all show up for everybody. I don't know if they will, but I'm hoping so. I don't know how to even post a question on the Q&A. Type answer live. And then there's also, like I said, I mean, people, you all can Google this as well. Just Google the words since time immemorial curriculum, as well as as long as the river runs. Okay, so I'm sure you can find it if you search for those two things. Okay. All right, I think we're there now. Hearing drums right now, so I don't know where that's coming from. It could well be the curriculum. Oh yeah, that's the start of As Long as the River Runs. Sorry, that was me in my video. All right, you guys. I think that is it, Elsa. I don't think there's any other questions that I can see in the Q&A.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. This was wonderful. And thanks everyone for attending tonight. And we'll welcome you back anytime, Mina. We'd love to have you come back about at least once a quarter.
I think we can cover the ferry fair too.
I think so. All right.
Thank you. Thank you all for inviting me. I was quite enjoyable.
All right, cool.
Good night.
Good night.